The morning had started in the kind of stillness that only winter could create. Soft light touched the mountainside, and for a moment everything looked peaceful enough to quiet any wandering thought. But that peace had lasted only seconds before the earth gave a deep rumble, like a giant shifting in its sleep. The avalanche came fast, too fast for anyone on the trail to understand what was happening. By the time the rescue team arrived, the world had already gone silent again, but this silence felt wrong. It wasn't calm. It was the kind that pressed against your ears and made your chest feel tight. They stepped out onto the snow-covered terrain, their boots sinking into layers that had just swallowed an entire section of the hiking route. There were no voices calling out for help, no movement beneath the white surface. Only the wind whispered across the broken landscape, carrying tiny crystals of snow that stung whenever they hit exposed skin. The rescuers exchanged uneasy glances, trying to read the scene the way experience had taught them. But even experience had limits when everything looked wiped clean. Rex, their German shepherd, didn't wait for instructions. His nose lifted sharply, catching scents the humans couldn't possibly detect. He paced in a restless arc, pulling against the tension of his harness, letting out a low whine that grew heavier with every passing second. His handler tried to steady him, murmuring reassurance, but it was clear Rex wasn't reacting to nerves or confusion. Something had grabbed his attention deep beneath the snow. As the team set up their scanning equipment, Rex's unease hung over them like an unspoken warning. Something was down there. Something they weren't seeing yet, but he did. The team began to spread out carefully, marking sections of snow and following their standard search grid. It was a routine they all trusted, one built from years of training and hard-earned experience. But Rex had no interest in routine today. The moment his handler loosened the grip on his harness, he lunged toward a small ridge of compacted snow several yards away. His paws scraped across the icy surface, sending loose flakes scattering behind him. "Rex! Leave it! Come back!" His handler called out, his voice firm but calm. Rex didn't even look back. Instead, he barked sharply, the sound echoing through the hollow landscape. It wasn't the kind of bark he used during training sessions or practice searches. This one carried urgency and fear. He lowered his head and began digging with quick, determined strokes, throwing chunks of snow behind him as if time itself were chasing him. One of the rescuers shook her head. "That spot doesn't make sense. The victims were farther up the trail. There's no way anyone ended up down here." Another nodded in agreement, trusting logic, maps, and probability. But Rex kept digging until his paws hit the harder crust beneath. He stepped back only to bark again, louder this time, frustration shaking through his entire body. His handler tried once more to pull him away, but Rex resisted with a strength that came from instinct rather than training. The team exchanged uneasy looks. They respected Rex, but even the best dogs had moments of confusion. Snow carried scent strangely. Wind distorted trails. Logic told them this spot wasn't part of the collapse pattern. Then it happened. Rex stopped mid-dig, lifted his head, and let out a long, trembling howl, not loud, but low and haunting, the kind of sound that prickled along the skin. The mountains seemed to hold their breath as the howl faded. The rescuers went still. A howl like that didn't come from uncertainty. It came from knowing something was beneath them, something fragile, something fading. And for the first time, doubt shifted. Maybe Rex wasn't mistaken. Maybe someone down there still had a chance, but not for much longer. The team approached the ridge with a mixture of reluctance and responsibility, each step crunching through the snow in a way that made the silence feel even heavier. Rex stood over the spot he had been digging at, his chest rising and falling quickly, as if he'd been holding his breath this whole time. His handler sighed softly, gave a small nod to the others, and lowered the probe into the snow. It sank through the top layer easily, sliding past loose powder before hitting the compacted sheet beneath. Nothing unusual. Nothing promising. Another rescuer tried from a slightly different angle. Again, the probe returned with nothing. No shift, no void, no resistance. The doubts grew thicker. A few exchanged glances, the kind that carried unsaid questions. Maybe their instincts were right and the spot was a dead end. Maybe Rex was picking up old scents or confusing echoes from deeper inside the snowpack. But Rex wasn't backing away. He paced in a tight circle, nose low, tail rigid, eyes fixed on the place where their probes had failed. He gave a frustrated whine, then suddenly lowered his head and pushed his snout beneath a thin curtain of ice. The team watched him, torn between logic and the uneasy pull of something they couldn't quite name. Then they heard it. A faint, hollow sound, almost like tapping, or the soft shift of something buried beneath. It was barely there, softer than a whisper, but unmistakable. The rescuers froze. Even the wind seemed to pause long enough for them to hear it again, just once, before fading into stillness. Rex scraped at the snow with renewed urgency, and this time something small tumbled free, a scrap of fabric, frayed and stiff from the cold. His handler picked it up, brushing off the frost. It wasn't the kind of generic material that became scattered in avalanches. This had color, stitching, it belonged to someone. Someone reported missing. A quiet shock rippled through the group as the truth settled in. Rex hadn't been mistaken. He had been trying to pull them toward the only sign of life left out here. The team tightened their gloves, exchanged determined nods, and began to dig, carefully, urgently, aware that the frozen layers could collapse at any moment, taking whatever hope remained with them. The digging began slow, precise, almost painfully careful. Every strike of the shovel felt like it carried the weight of a life. Snow that had seemed soft from a distance turned out to be hard as stone, frozen into stubborn layers that fought back against every movement. The rescuers could feel their muscles tightening, their breath turning sharp inside their chests, but no one dared pause. Not now. Not when Rex was pacing beside them like a heartbeat they couldn't afford to ignore. Easy, steady, one rescuer muttered, though the word sounded more like a plea to fate than instruction. Rex stayed close, so close that his fur brushed the edge of the digging line. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't confused. He barked every few seconds, the rhythm strangely deliberate, almost guiding. His handler tried to pull him back, but Rex planted his paws and refused. Whatever was beneath them mattered to him in a way no one could yet explain. Minutes passed like hours. The cold bit deeper. Gloves stiffened. Fingers numbed. Even the strongest among them felt that creeping burn in their arms, the kind that said they were pushing beyond what the body usually allows. Then a rescuer shifted his weight, drove his shovel down, and froze. "Wait, everyone stop." The team held their breath. He tapped again. This time, the sound was unmistakable, an echo, hollow and fragile. A gasp rippled through the group. "There's space down there," another whispered. "Not enough to guarantee survival. Not enough to offer comfort. But enough to spark hope." They cleared more snow by hand now, terrified of collapsing whatever pocket existed beneath the ice. The cold stung their knuckles, cut into their skin, but no one complained. Rex whined suddenly, leaning forward, nose pressed against the ground as though he could smell life slipping away. "Someone's alive," the handler murmured, voice trembling. The fear wasn't just about being too late. It was about making the wrong move, closing the fragile chamber instead of opening it. That's what made grown men hesitate. Time wasn't just running out. It felt like it was standing right beside them, watching every decision they made. The digging had settled into a tense rhythm when one of the rescuers suddenly stopped mid-motion. His hand, buried wrist-deep in powdery ice, went still. He didn't speak at first. He just inhaled sharply, the kind of breath a person takes when they aren't sure if their mind is playing tricks on them. "Hold on," he whispered. I felt something. Everyone leaned in, afraid to even exhale too loudly. He reached again, fingers brushing along the uneven edge of hardened snow. Then he jerked his hand back, eyes wide. "It's warm," he said. "There's a hand. Someone's moving." The world snapped into focus. Shovels were tossed aside. The team switched instantly to delicate, controlled movements, clearing ice with the carefulness of surgeons. No one shouted orders anymore, they didn't need to. Each rescuer knew exactly what had to be done, and the urgency unified them. Rex stopped barking altogether. He crouched low, head tilted, a soft whine slipping from his chest. He wasn't urging them forward anymore, he was waiting. Listening. Almost protecting. The rescuers carved away the last fragile layer, and then, slowly, a trembling hand emerged. Pale. Stiff. But undeniably alive. Fingers curled weakly toward the light as though reaching for something familiar. "There you go," one rescuer murmured gently, brushing snow from the frail wrist. "We've got you." More ice fell away. A forehead. A pair of closed eyes. Then finally, a face appeared, young, drained of color, lips trembling as though fighting for the strength to speak. Frost clung to her hair, but her chest rose in faint, stubborn breaths. She wasn't just surviving. She was trying to come back. The woman's hand tightened around the torn fabric Rex had found earlier, gripping it as if it were the last thread connecting her to the world above. Her eyelids fluttered. Then, with immense effort, she looked upward. Her gaze didn't land on the rescuers first. It found Rex. A fragile spark flickered in her eyes, something like recognition, or gratitude too deep for words. And for a moment, in the freezing silence, hope felt warmer than the cold surrounding them. The rescuers continued clearing the snow around her with slow, deliberate motions, creating just enough space for air to move freely. The young woman's eyelids fluttered again, and this time her lips parted. A thin, broken whisper slipped out, a sound so faint the team had to lean closer just to catch it. "Help, please, you're safe now," one rescuer said softly. "Don't try to talk. Just breathe." But she kept trying. Her voice cracked with each attempt, as if the words themselves were trapped somewhere deep in the cold still clinging to her chest. Her breaths were shallow, uneven, the kind that came from hours of fighting panic in suffocating darkness. One rescuer gently brushed snow from her shoulders. "She tried to dig," he murmured to the others. "Look at her nails, she was clawing upward the whole time." The realization struck all of them at once. She hadn't just been buried, she had fought her way toward life until her strength ran out. Her fingers, bruised and raw, told a story she couldn't. Rex lowered himself beside the opening, resting his head near the gap. His warm breath drifted toward her, and her trembling eased almost immediately. She turned her face slightly toward him, recognizing the comfort he brought. A tiny tear gathered at the corner of her eye, but before it could fall, it froze against her skin, a fragile mark of everything she had endured. Hours. She had survived for hours in a place where most people lasted minutes. One rescuer whispered, "She's tougher than she looks." Another nodded. She held on long enough for someone to hear her, even if none of us could. Rex's ears twitched at that, as if he understood. She couldn't speak her story yet, but her silence told enough. She had refused to give up, and somehow, against every odd, she had been found. They had managed to lift the young woman from the snow, supporting her fragile body as though it might shatter under its own weight. Each step back toward the waiting medics was careful, deliberate, but her hands were shaking, gripping at anything she could reach. The rescuers had assumed the worst was behind them, that the immediate danger had passed. Then, as they reached a small cleared patch, she drew a shallow breath and whispered words that stopped the world. "My son, he's still there." The rescuers froze mid-step. Her eyes were wide, panic flashing through the exhaustion and pale frost of her face. She weakly gestured downward, toward the deeper snow where the avalanche had buried her. The air shifted, an almost tangible weight of dread pressing against their chests. Rex stiffened instantly. His ears pricked, eyes narrowing. He barked sharply, the kind of bark that demanded attention, then ran a few steps toward a deeper section of collapsed snow. The team halted in place, a silence broken only by the dog's urgent insistence. Every rescuer knew what this meant. There was another life beneath the ice, one that had gone unnoticed. Exhaustion mingled with fear. Sweat froze on brows, muscles burned from hours of grueling labor, yet no one dared move recklessly. Each movement now carried the risk of crushing whatever fragile space remained below. The woman's hand shook as she pointed again, emphasizing the spot. Time felt like a blade against their nerves, every second a countdown. The first shovel cut into the deeper layer of snow. Then another. Small pieces of ice and debris fell away, revealing something strange, a padded, insulated carrier wedged under splintered wood. A faint cry echoed from within. The rescuers froze again, then slowly, cautiously, cleared the remaining debris. The cry grew louder, a tiny, fragile sound that carried the weight of life itself. Tears streamed freely. Some rescuers whispered prayers, others sobbed openly. Rex's soft whining became almost mournful, as though his heart were breaking with the team. The woman fell to her knees beside the carrier, clutching at the child as though the world had narrowed down to that single, miraculous moment. Hours of fear, despair, and struggle erupted into a flood of relief, gratitude, and raw, unfiltered emotion. In that instant, the avalanche's devastation seemed to pause, giving way to the power of survival, love, and unwavering loyalty. The rescuers carefully lifted the carrier's lid, their hands trembling despite years of training. Inside lay a tiny boy, curled up against the padding, his body shivering violently but moving just enough to show he was alive. His eyes fluttered open briefly, the faintest glimmer of awareness meeting the team's exhausted, relieved gazes. It didn't take long for the rescuers to understand what had kept him alive. The mother had positioned herself directly above him, creating a barrier with her own body. Each inch of her struggle had absorbed the avalanche's impact, shielding him from the crushing weight of snow and debris. She hadn't been fighting only for her own survival. Every second, every desperate breath, had been to protect her child. The realization hit with overwhelming force. Her sacrifice had been complete and instinctive, a mother's love embodied in frozen silence and sheer determination. Rex lowered his head gently, brushing the boy's cheek with his warm tongue. The gesture was tender, protective, and almost reverent. The child responded with a tiny shiver and a faint sigh, as if understanding the comfort the dog offered. The rescuers looked at one another, their faces pale and unsteady, hearts heavy with the enormity of what they had just witnessed. In that fragile moment, everything converged: maternal instinct, unwavering loyalty, and the miracle of life against impossible odds. A small, trembling child had survived a disaster that could have easily claimed both lives. The bond between the mother and her son, unseen until now, and the dog's intuitive guidance reminded everyone that survival was never just about luck. It was about love, courage, and the quiet, extraordinary ways that protection can manifest. Time seemed to pause, leaving only the sound of the boy's shallow breaths, the mother's exhausted sighs, and Rex's soft, constant presence beside them. At last, the rescuers stepped back, their work complete. Both the mother and her son were secured, blankets wrapped tightly around them, breaths slowing, warmth returning to their frozen limbs. Rex, finally easing the tension that had gripped him for hours, lowered his head onto the soft snow beside the stretcher. His eyes closed briefly, but his ears twitched, ever alert, as if making sure the danger had truly passed. The mother, still trembling, reached out a hand. Her fingers hovered above his thick fur before brushing gently across his shoulder. Tears ran down her cheeks, leaving streaks that glistened in the pale sunlight. Through a soft, shaking whisper, she spoke words that carried more meaning than any command or praise. "He heard us when no one else could." The team looked at Rex with a new understanding. Not just a trained search dog, not just a companion. They saw the hero who refused to give up, who followed instincts that saved 2 lives. Each rescuer felt the weight of that realization, the awe of witnessing something that could not be measured in training hours or procedures. It was something larger, a bond between human and animal that had defied the odds, had bridged fear and hope in the frozen silence of the avalanche. Above them, the helicopter's blades cut the sky as the crew prepared to lift the survivors. And then, as if acknowledging the miracle on the ground, the clouds parted. Warm sunlight spilled over the mountainside, glinting off the snow and illuminating the battered trail below. The silence that had once felt so empty now held a quiet reverence. The world seemed to exhale alongside the rescuers, the mother, her child, and Rex. In that moment, hope, loyalty, and courage converged, leaving everyone with the profound reminder that even in the harshest cold, compassion and determination could spark life where it seemed impossible.